Hello, everybody. This is an introduction into the unit of culture. It's actually probably my favorite unit of the year, and I'm glad we're getting to finish off the first semester with this particular unit. It's really important that we understand some of the basic ideas of culture before we really start taking a deeper look at some of the unique things around the world. So, in this, I'm going to be talking about some important vocabulary and giving you some specific examples of these different terms and concepts that will be valuable, not just for this unit, but as we move forward into future units as well. So what exactly is culture? All right. Culture is the shared practices, attitudes, technologies, and behaviors transmitted by a society. And so we have this idea of culture being everything from language to religion to how we dress to how we educate our children to the foods we eat, the customs, the holidays we follow, the ways that we elect leaders or choose leaders, the way we distribute goods and services. All of these things comprise culture. And it's really the overall behaviors of society. A way of thinking about it is kind of like a blueprint. It's a blueprint for how we're supposed to act and to share with each other. And so culture is kind of the way of life for everybody, right? It's kind of another way of saying it's our way of life. And within that, we have what we call cultural traits. So all of the different aspects of culture that we associate with culture, right? Those are just what we call cultural traits. These are our food preferences, the clothing we wear, right? The architecture that we see around our cities and our towns. It's how we're using the land, right? How are we using it? Are we using it for farming? Are we using it for parks? Are we using it for development, right? It's all of these different things, right? So any individual thing that goes on within a culture, that is a cultural trait. And so every single culture has thousands and thousands of different cultural traits. Some that make them, similar to others, and some that greatly differentiate those cultures from one another. All right, so no culture is identical, but they do have similar cultural traits. And so as we go through this, we have to understand there's kind of two ways that people look at culture. Cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, right? And these are different attitudes that people bring towards their view of culture. All right? And it's basically how you're going to view others, right? And the way they do things, all right? So cultural relativism is this idea that a person believes values and practice should be understood based on that person's own culture rather than be judged against the criteria of another, right? So it's basically saying our culture is this way, your culture is this way. They're both equally valid ways of going about things, right? We can't say that yours is worse because it's different than mine, right? You've just decided that you're going to deal with a particular issue through your culture in a slightly different way, right? So that could be beliefs, or it could be, clothing preferences or architectural preferences, right? Neither one is better, right? We just have to understand that we all have unique ways of going about things, all right? Whereas ethnocentrism is really more of this idea that we're evaluating other cultures based on preconceptions originating in the standards and customs of one's own culture. All right. So as you see from kind of the example here, right? A Muslim woman wearing a hijab or some sort of covering on her head, people in Western cultures often see that as being oppressed, right? That these women are subservient to their husband, that their culture does not allow them to have certain rights. Whereas we view, say, a Catholic nun, dressed in a very similar way as being this righteous person who's choosing to give their life to God and to practice their beliefs in a certain way, right? Very similar, cultural trait, but viewed very differently, right? So ethnocentrism is this idea that my culture, my way of life, is better than yours, right? Because of X, Y, and Z, right? So these are two different ways that we can look at this. And in the Western world, right, we see both of these at play, right? We see the multicultural viewpoint of cultural relativism, right? That different cultural histories, different cultural beliefs can exist side by side, right? And they can live harmoniously together, right? But then we also see in places like the United States and parts of Europe, in the way that maybe people of minority groups or other religions might be treated, right? That those religions, those minority groups, those different cultures are inferior, that they're weakening the different countries based on the fact that these inferior cultures are coming in, right? So two different ways of looking at culture, right? Clearly, one of them is more accepting than the other. Okay, so another thing we want to be clear about is that cultures, by how they adapt the environments, right? How their cultural traits adapt the environment and make it so that people can live in a particular place, it creates a very unique landscape, right? And the cultural landscape, we've talked a lot about this so far this year, but it's coming back around again, is just essentially the human built environment, right? It's the way humans have changed the environment, right? How they've added to it, changed it, adapted to it to survive, right? And so anything we see in the world that is built, right, that is what we now call the cultural landscape. And you can look across the globe for very unique examples of the cultural landscape, right? We have a few pictures here on this slide, right? For example, in Brazil, right, you have the Christ Redeemer statue that's been built on top of the mountain overlooking Rio de Janeiro, right? This is a unique part of their own cultural landscape, right? Or you have the Great Wall of China, which was built as a protection many centuries ago, but now as a major tourist attraction, right? But that's part of the built environment, right? Or you have the French architecture in New Orleans, right, with the unique balconies overlooking the French Quarter. Or you have the Shinto gates in Japan, or the unique Scandinavian architecture in places like Norway, right, with the steep pitched roofs, right, so that snow falls off of the roof. Okay, and so you have these very unique landscapes around the globe, and these are what define these regions, right? We when we think of these different regions, we think of these types of cultural markers, right? These cultural traits, these landscapes. All right, so we'll be studying this idea of the cultural landscape much further. And what I'd like you to do at this time is take a few minutes to watch this video. It's over on Google Classroom, and see what the cultural landscapes can possibly tell us about these different places that we're finding them in, right? What are the unique traits that could tell us more about the culture of that region? So take a few minutes, watch that video, and then come back here. Okay, so you've watched that video. And just to kind of give you an idea about cultural landscapes, right? You can see, for example, above ground cemeteries in places like New Orleans, which are very low-lying areas, right? In order to not have their bodies washed away by tides and things like that, right? They've buried their dead in above ground cemeteries. Okay, and so you have this very unique cultural landscape within the United States, found in places like New Orleans, right? And we can very easily identify that based on the image here. Another example of the cultural landscape is what we call terraced farming, right? Or these steps have been cut into the mountain so that rice can be grown on these steps in the hill, right? And this is something that is very identifiable for this part of Southeast Asia. And this allows them to be able to grow food to support their people. All right. So another example, you don't have to build something necessarily, right? You can cut into the existing landscape, right? And because you're adapting it, because humans are changing it, right? This makes it part of the cultural landscape. Another example, this is in Afghanistan. You can see this big giant hole in the side of the mountain. At one point held a Buddhist statue that was destroyed by the Taliban, but the hole in the cliff still exists, right? You can also see holes, smaller holes built into the mountain that were used for residence, right? People lived within those in the mountain place, and we see this type of cultural landscape in other parts of the world, right? Like the southwest of the United States, right? We have examples of people carving into mountains places to live and survive. Okay, so again, changing the natural landscape for human needs, right? This is part of the cultural landscape. Now, a unique thing within the cultural landscape is something called sequence occupancy. And this is the idea that over time, right, different groups will come to live within a certain area, a certain region, a certain city, a certain town, whatever. And those different groups will bring their own cultural traditions and traits to that, right? And they will build layers upon the existing cultural landscape, right? So you have this different sequence of different occupants that are now building on top of each other. And a good example of this is the Grijalba in Seville, Spain. Here you have what is now currently a Catholic cathedral that exhibits signs of having different groups of people having lived here, right? Because what you can't just necessarily tell from this picture, but is known through history, is that at one point this was a Islamic mosque, right? The big bell tower to the right of the picture at one point was the minaret, which called people to prayer on their holy day, right? And you can see in some of the architecture that there's Islamic or Moorish influences in the architecture in this particular example, but all over parts of Spain, because at one point many parts of Spain were controlled by Islamic Moors. All right. So while this is now a Catholic cathedral, it at one point was an Islamic mosque, and even before it became an Islamic mosque, it was a church and a cathedral before that, right? So you've had different groups of people living in this particular area who have brought their cultural influences to one very particular landmark. All right, so sequent occupancy is a very common thing you see throughout the world, right? And you can think about places, in the United States, right, where say Native Americans have, lived, and now when Europeans arrived, right, they started imposing their way of life upon the landscape, right? So this happens all over the world. And another good example of this is a place like Jerusalem, right, where you have many different religions imposing their cultural traits and beliefs upon the landscape, right? And for example, Jerusalem, you have in the forefront you have the wall of the old temple of Judaism, right? That was in Jerusalem. But on top of that, you have the Golden Dome of Islam, right? And so you have Jewish and Islamic traditions built on top of each other, and in other parts of the city, right, you have Christian traditions which are built upon Jewish architecture, right? So, and then you also have kind of in the background, you can see the more modern Western architecture of skyscrapers and things like that, right? So you have many different layers of culture on top of each other. You also see within areas places like Chinatown, right? We've seen a picture like this before, right? We talked about, this idea of, observing ways in which culture can intertwine, right? And, you have in places like Chinatowns and, Little Italies and Koreatowns and things like that across the U.S., you have had groups of migrants who have come to the United States and wanting to be near people who have the same culture, who speak the same language, who practice the same religions, who eat the same foods and dress the same and have similar practices, right? And so due to wanting to exist within those familiar traits, right, they've come together into what we call enclaves, right, which is an area of a particular culture within a bigger, more dominant culture, right? And in many ways, it's separated from the more dominant culture, right? And you can see here, you have a lot of Chinese characters. You have the Chinese lanterns in the middle of the road. You have the Chinese lamps, right, lining the streets. Um, and if you've ever been through Chinatown in San Francisco, right, the ideas of Chinese wet markets are very much prevalent in places like Chinatown. And so you see a very unique culture within a more dominant culture, right? And this is what we call an ethnic enclave. And these have existed for centuries, right? And not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world where you've had smaller cultures that exist within a small area, surrounded by maybe more dominant cultures. All right. So these cultural traits, right, are moving, right, are spreading, right, around the globe, and so we're gonna move beyond just looking at these basic terms, and now we want to see how are they spreading, how are they what we call diffusing, right, the concept of diffusion. How are they diffusing cultural traits around the world, and what are some examples of that? Okay, so what you'll do after watching this is there's a couple pages in the textbook that I would like you to read, along with a little video that goes with it. All right, and we will pick this up and talk more about this on Friday when we return to class. All right, so thank you for paying attention. Hopefully you took some good notes, and I will talk to you guys on Friday.